Hello, my name is Osha, and I like to talk about history. I'm continuing with my discussion on the ancient civilizations in the Near East or the Middle East. I had begun with the Sumerian civilization, which is actually considered the first civilization in the world. Started with in 4500 BC in the area of Mesopotamia. If you want to roughly peg where Mesopotamia is, you can say modern day Iraq, right? Um, of course, I talked about how Abraham was supposed to have come from Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in it's in modern day Iraq. That's part of Mesopotamia. So that's significant, right? The Chaldeans. So because later on, there's this civilization that developed in that area. That's Babylonians. They're called the Neo-Babylonians or the Chaldean Babylonians. The Chaldean Babylonians in they came up around roughly 626 BC, and they are famous for the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. They destroyed their leader, their king was Nebuchadnezzar the second, right, in the Bible, mentioned in the book of Daniel. And he destroyed Jerusalem, right, and took the Jewish people captive and took them to Babylon in 587 BC. And of course, for people who are familiar with the Bible, there's the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar was the king who, he went crazy, lived like a beast, and a lot going on. Now later on, though, the Persians, right under Cyrus the Great, who founded the Achaemenid Empire, would come on to destroy would conquer, so rather, the Babylonian Empire, right? Conquer the Babylonian Empire in five, so the Persian Empire or the Achaemenids under Cyrus the Great came up around 550 BC, 550 BC, and the Jewish people were liberated by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, and they were allowed to go back and rebuild their homelands and their temples. That's 539 BC. But the Persian Empire was not the first empire in the territory of modern Iran. There was an earlier one called the Elamite Empire. The Elamite Empire started from roughly 3200 BC and eventually until it was absorbed around 550 540 BC into the Persian Empire of the Achaemenids, right? The Elamites, they were not Persians. In fact, it's not clear what race they were or what linguistic group they belonged to, because they were not Semitic, right? And they were not Aryans like the Persians were. So it's not clear what they were, but they ended up being absorbed by the Persians, right? They ended up being absorbed by the Persians of the Achaemenid Empire. So the Elamite Empire came up around 3200 BC, and their capital was in Susa. I'm mentioning Susa because it's very relevant till today. Susa was their capital, and the Achaemenids also made it one of their capitals. So that site is still often excavated today. Under Reza Khan, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925. Of course, he would now create laws because Europeans like the French who had, they had the right to, so I think, sole rights to prospect there in the Susa area because of the historic sites, but they were looting these historic sites. So Iran is a center to many great historical sites, right? The capital of one of them is Persepolis, very famous, was the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, Persepolis, and that's the site of Susa is very famous. Um, well, prior to the Elamites, right, there was the Elamite Empire, as I said, in 3200 BC, and they often clashed with the Akkadians, the other empires, right, in Iraq. Now, there were also the Assyrians. These were in Iraq, though, in modern day Iraq, in Mesopotamia. The Assyrian Empire. I'm mentioning these because they were in the Bible, right? They're in the Bible for those of us who like studying the Bible. The Assyrians were north of a group called, they were Arameans, right? The Arameans were north of the Babylonian area, the Babylonian Empire. So Babylon, the you know I mentioned how Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans. So that area of Babylonia and the Mesopotamia, they're within the same area. There's Ur, it was one of the city states of the Sumerians. There's Ur, there's Lagash, there's Uruk, right? And they were Chaldeans. So Neo-Chaldeans were these Babylonians. That's Nebuchadnezzar, right? And he defeat the Assyrians who were in the north. The Assyrians, their empire started since the roughly 14th century, right? 14th century BC. The Assyrians, they had their kingdom, but they expanded their empire tremendously, extensively around the 9th century BC. But Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, he was a Chaldean. He would overthrow them, conquer them during his reign, which was from 626 BC. And he's the one, as I said, who conquered Jerusalem. He destroyed Jerusalem and took Jewish people captive in 587 BC until Cyrus the Great, who founder of the Achaemenid Empire, liberated them in 539 BC after he had conquered the Babylonian Empire. So the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians under Nebuchadnezzar II. So lots of empires. There was also another empire that came about. They already existed, maybe by the 9th century. The Assyrians noted them. That's the Median Empire, which is north. It's within the Iran's territory. It was north. The Medes, the Medians, right? It was in northwest area of Iran, right next to it was to the east of the Assyrian kingdom, right? So the Medes were also absorbed by the Achaemenids. They were absorbed by the Achaemenids. The Medes were absorbed by the Achaemenids, and the Elamites were absorbed by the Achaemenids. So the first civilization within the territory of Iran was the Elamite Empire, which started from around 3200 BC, right? But there was always this overlap and conflict with those empires whose capital and origins were in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is modern day Iraq. Now again to the north, where the Assyrians, under the Assyrians, further south, were the Arameans, and further south, right, were the Babylonians, right? Now, interestingly, the Arameans, we come across them in the Bible. Remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, Jacob is described as an Aramean. If anybody knows that passage in the Bible, my father was a wandering Aramean with a few people. He went into Egypt, and they grew into a great, mighty, and prosperous nation. But the Egyptians, mistreated us, right? So that was Jacob being described as an Aramean. Why is Jacob described as an Aramean? Remember, he fled from his family. He fled from his family. Fled from because of the wrath of his brother Esau, right? Esau, also called Edom. So he fled from Esau because he had stolen Esau's birthright, right? His blessing when their father Isaac was dying, and so Jacob fled and he went to stay with his mother's brother, his uncle Laban. So Laban was an Aramean, right? He lived in that area, Aramean. So he said, so that's why the Bible in Deuteronomy says, my father was a wandering Aramean because it's fled and lived in that area of Aram. So these languages west of the Persians, right, in the Mesopotamian uh, area, right, including the Jewish people, they're called the Semitic languages, right, the Semitic tribes, right. I'll stop this video here. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.